time, as did Alexander Hamilton, and of course here in Pennsylvania, Ben Franklin. I would say this about Aaron Burr's slave owning. Again, it's hard to get into his head, but it would seem that, at least in Burr's case, and maybe some of these other gentlemen as well, who were, I think, sincerely against slavery, they did not view it as a permanent condition. In Burr's case particularly, we know that he was very keen on having his slaves educated. Not all slave owners were necessarily for this, I'm sure many of you know that. But Burr saw to it that his slaves, and again, I stress, we're only talking maybe 2 or 3 slaves at a time who were domestics. He saw to it that they all learned to read and write, and in one case, one documented case at least, he even pays for a female slave to go to school, which is pretty extraordinary. If you know anything about Aaron Burr, you may also know he was very keen on education for women, and even though his daughter, Theodosia, the younger, couldn't go to any college, he saw to it that she received the equivalent of a university education. So it seems, I think, I would say this, Burr's view of slavery was more of a temporary condition, not a permanent one, where he viewed them more similarly like to apprentices or indentured servants. Second point I wanted to mention, and hope maybe some of you may have, I don't want to take up too much time, but some of you may have more questions about this. This is a very exciting thing I only recently learned as I was trying to get a handle on where Burr might have gotten his anti-slavery ideas from. And this has to do with a court case that is not nearly as well known today as it should be, that freed all the slaves in the state of Massachusetts in 1781. Just very briefly, of the states that were of the original 13, those in the north that did end slavery, with the sole exception of Massachusetts, all the others abolished slavery gradually through the legislative process, not the courts, through these gradual abolition bills such as I just described. But in Massachusetts was different. Their slaves were freed all at once by court order, and it was because of a case that, much to my amazement, Aaron Burr's brother-in-law, a Connecticut lawyer named Tapping Reeve, was involved in it. The case is known as Brom, B-R-O-M, and Bet, B-E-T-T. Those were 2 slaves. Brom was a male and Bet was a female. The case is called Brom and Bet versus Ashley. Brom and Bet were slaves belonging to the same owner, Ashley, Joseph Ashley. They lived in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, which was the home of many of Burr's Edward's relatives. Burr he never lived there himself, but he visited there frequently because he had uncles and loads of cousins who lived up there. So Burr was well known in the town. Brom and Bet went to a local lawyer named Theodore Sedgwick, who had known anti-slavery views, and asked him to take their case. And interestingly, what were they basing their case on? They were basing it on the brand new Massachusetts state constitution, written by John Adams, that in its preamble said, all men are born free and equal. Nowadays you have to specify, they meant all human beings by men, okay? And Bet, the female slave, who's also known locally as Mumbet, and Mumbet even has her own webpage, and later after her freedom, she took the name Elizabeth Freeman. Mumbet went to Theodore Sedgwick and asked him to take their case, and he agreed, but he immediately called on Tapping Reeve, who was in Litchfield, Connecticut, which is actually close to the Massachusetts border where Stockbridge is, to be his co-counsel. Tappan Reeve was well known as a teacher of the law, in fact, the founder of the nation's first law school, which you can go and see in Litchfield, Connecticut, the little building. Aaron Burr, his brother-in-law, was his first pupil prior to the American Revolution. And Reeve later becomes a judge. But to my knowledge, he hadn't been known as a trial lawyer particularly, but in this case, he and Sedgwick scored a big win for the slaves. There was a jury trial, and the jury trial ordered Brom and Bett were in fact free, according to the state constitution. Their owner Ashley was upset, of course, and said he was going to appeal, but then he changed his mind and decided against it when he realized that he would not win the appeal. I don't want to go off on a tangent on this. I'm mentioning it because of the Aaron Burr connection, but I wonder, did this case influence Burr in any way? And I will just say this. At the time this case was being argued in 1781, guess what? Aaron Burr and his then fiancée, Theodosia, actually went to visit the Reeves in Litchfield, Connecticut, and Theodosia actually ended up staying there for some months. So we know Burr was very close to his sister, Sally Burr Reeve, and her husband, and surely this case must have been the topic of conversation. We also know, years later, Burr was in fact well aware of this case, and he referred to it in a speech he gave on the floor of the U.S. Senate in 1794, the case where Brom and Bett were freed. So that's just a little bit of where I am in my research, and I thank you for your attention, and I am thrilled to be here today, and want to commend Aaron Burr to you as someone who was not only concerned with ending slavery, but also with preserving the rights of free blacks as citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. How's everybody holding up?
Blinded by the light.
We're not done quite yet. However, at the end of this phase, we're going to go over to 2 tents that you can see in the back of the office for food and refreshment and bonding. Just a couple of points. Aaron Burr lived at Richmond Hill. That was his estate in New York, what is now New York City. He often hosted leaders of the black or African American community at his home, and also Native American leaders. And he was often heavily criticized by some of his fellow aristocrats for doing that. The second point, I believe, Sue, my understanding is that Tappan Reeves Law School in Connecticut, Litchfield, is the oldest law school in the country that awarded degrees. Meaning, I think the law school at William and Mary was actually established first in time, but it did not award degrees back then. That's my understanding.
Could be right about that.
Okay.
I'm not sure, but I think William and Mary taught law. I think the distinction is this, but I'm not 100% sure. William and Mary taught law as just one subject as part of its undergraduate curriculum. But Tappan Reeves was the first to actually have a school that specifically trained lawyers to prepare them for the bar.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Our next phase, where Sherry will be moderating, is called Tributes to John Pierre Burr, and question and answers.
So Sue and I are professors, and when we give talks, we're very used to people having comments or questions, And so at this point, if you have a comment or a question that you have about what we said or about John Pierre, please ask it now.
Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Paul Jock Keene. And I would argue that there are 5 branches. One of the branches is here in Pennsylvania in terms of county branches. And what I mean by that is there were 5 Mitchells. Luella, Miriam, Eugene, Teddy, and my mother is the baby. She is still here. And Burr has been a part of our family for many, many years. In fact, I'm looking around and seeing a number of Burr descendants here, which is positive because within the African community, it necessarily wasn't always a positive thing to say you were related to Aaron Burr, because of what historically we know. And so, but there are stories that have gone on, held in the family, one of which was John Pierre was a barber. And one of the stories that has been passed down to us over the years is that when he took escaped slaves out, he used to take them out in the evening, and he would walk ahead and they would be behind. And if he was stopped, he would say, and they would say, well, who are you with? And they would say, I'm with my boy. Because he was fair-skinned and passed for white, and particularly at night. So these stories are handed down. There's a small one left over many years. But it's nice to know that this recognition is still there, because illegitimate or legitimate, however you want to look at it, son of slave owners and their slaves went on, and many of us are the consequences of those years. So I don't know how many Burrs are here right now, but would you stand if you are related? Please. I got a wave over there. All right. So his genes still continue. At least we're still here, and that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you for acknowledging all the Burr cousins, including Lori. You mentioned the story of the John Pierre conducting the slaves. That was written by Miriam Burr Cornish in 1939, and that's been carried down. And there's Lori. Mary Burr Cornish was Lori's great-great-grandfather, and she's mother. She's helping us with the reception, so I want to thank her for all her food efforts. So thank you, Cousin Lori. And thank you all the other cousins who are here in the audience. Are there other questions about John Pierre or Aaron that you have at this moment before we retire?
I just have a quick one. You know, John Pierre is buried here. Is Teddy buried here as well?
Thank you for that question, Reverend. When the remains of John Pierre were moved from Olive Cemetery to Eden Cemetery in 1909, they lost the records. So all we have is of records is that John Pierre is the owner of this plot. There are 3 grave plots, and there are up to 9 family members buried here. So we assume that Hetty is buried here with him, so that's why we added her name, that she was his wife, and we also added father of 10 children because we're assuming that some of the 10 children were buried here. I met a descendant of Matilda Burr, who was one of John Pierre's daughters, and she, like her mother Hester Elizabeth, was a dressmaker. Yes.
She's actually buried in the next cemetery over.
Oh, who is?
Julie Matilda Burr.
Oh, no. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think that we don't know.
No, but I do know that Julie
wonderful.
Matilda Burr is at the next cemetery that's on her death
and
certificate.
there should be a descendant of Charlotte Louisa here. Are there Louisa Charlotte? Yes. And so we're communicating back and forth about where Louisa Charlotte is buried. because one question we had was, are you going to do the same thing for Louisa Charlotte? And the Aaron Burr Association doesn't quite have records, but I'm going to converse with you about that and to make sure there is is there a headstone on her grave? There is not. Okay. So that's another fundraising project for Magic Stewart.
There are other Burrs buried here. Our grandmother, Lydia, Llewellyn Lydia Burr is buried here as well, along with her sisters. And some of which were Burr, but in their maiden names, but their family was Burr. And their father lived in Jenkintown.
Are there other questions related to, yes?
Hello, everybody. My name is Steve Kopsig, and I am the secretary for the Philadelphia Continental Chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution, and we are a lineage historical society. So for everybody that's in our organization, we have a direct lineage to somebody who participated in the Revolutionary War. And I would like to welcome everybody here to join our organization. You can look up or your local Sons of the American Revolution or Daughters of the American Revolution, because as direct descendants of Aaron Burr, Pierre Burr, you are eligible to be in our organization. Now we do education, and as I came here today, I became more educated. Thank you very much, Sherry, and the Burr Association for that. When Thomas Jefferson was co-authoring the Declaration of Independence, he put a clause in, and the clause was anti-slavery. Now he's trying to work with a group of people, and we're going to call those people government. And as Sherry had stated earlier, anytime you try to do any kind of negotiation, there's some kind of compromise that is taken. So there was a couple of delegations from the South, and that was Georgia and South Carolina, and there were some representatives from New England who they actually represented people who were engaged in the slave trade, and there was no way at all they were going to budge on having this type of legislation inside the Declaration of Independence. So there was a choice, and the choice was, do we continue on with trying to unite the country so we can break away from our oppressors and oppressor? And so they compromised and they took that part out. So the Declaration of Independence got out to the people of America, the colonists, soon to be the United States of America. But just like people read the legislation, there are some people who say, yeah, that's a good thing, they did something, and some people are like, well, that is not enough. So in 1777, there was a petition that was sent to Massachusetts to their legislature saying, hey, look, we read the Declaration of Independence, and yeah, we kind of like the words, everybody is created equal, but it's not really all that. So they presented this petition to the legislature in Massachusetts, and like lots of government policies, it died in committee. Dr. Bowles explained later where Massachusetts worked on that and actually got it through. Now, Thomas Jefferson was kind of tied because he was a slave owner, and he lived in Virginia. And so there's a paradox or a hypocrisy. As a matter of fact, when England was looking at the colonists saying, you are comparing yourself to slaves, how about this? Look out your back window and tell me what you see, because there's a lot of hypocrisy there. So Thomas Jefferson, being kind of torn, even though he did own slaves and he lived in Virginia, wanted to free his slaves. Now, George Washington, he died in 1799. When he died, he freed all of his slaves. They were all free. There was a law in Virginia that said that if you died, you could deed your freedom to your slave. But before Thomas Jefferson had a chance to die, which was in 1826, in 1806, the Virginia legislature passed a law that said, or they actually changed the law, that said, yeah, you can still free your slaves, but there are some administrative requirements. And when you actually look at what the government did, and it might just be the excuse is, well, we did something, but evidently it wasn't enough. They made it almost impossible for anybody who was going to be deeded their freedom to leave on good terms. And one of those terms was, if your master, so to speak, if your owner deeded your freedom, you had 1 year to leave the state and you can take nothing with you. You cannot have your family, you cannot have your children, you cannot have your grandchildren, you cannot have your mother,